Margaret had once believed that marriage was built not only on love, but on endurance. Love, she had learned from her mother, could be warm and beautiful in the beginning, but endurance was what carried two people through the seasons when beauty faded and hardship arrived. For 7 years, she held on to that belief with all the faith in her heart. She became the kind of wife who woke up before dawn, prepared breakfast before Franz left for work, remembered every small detail of his needs, and stood beside him even when the world seemed to turn its back on him. When Franz lost his first stable job, it was Margaret who sold the gold bracelet her late grandmother had given her so they could pay rent. When he wanted to start a small business but had no capital, it was Margaret who used her savings, money she had quietly collected for years, to help him begin again. When he grew frustrated, insecure, and angry at his own failures, she did not criticize him. She listened. She comforted. She told him that men did not become worthless because they stumbled. She told him they only became lost if they stopped trying. In those years, Margaret gave so much of herself that she hardly noticed how little she was receiving in return. At first, Franz had seemed grateful. He would hold her hand and say that one day he would repay all her sacrifices. He would promise her a beautiful home, peaceful evenings, and a future where she would never need to worry again. Margaret believed him because she loved him, and because love made her want to trust more than doubt. But as the years passed and Franz slowly found his footing, something in him changed. Success did not make him softer. It made him arrogant. His speech became sharper. His patience grew thinner. He began to speak to Margaret as if she were someone beneath him, someone who existed only to take care of his life quietly in the background. He no longer thanked her for the meals she prepared. He barely noticed when she waited late into the night for him to come home. Sometimes he came back smelling of expensive perfume that was not hers, and when she gently asked where he had been, he would laugh coldly and say she was imagining things. Margaret noticed the change, but she refused to think the worst. She told herself that maybe he was stressed. Maybe success had brought new pressure. Maybe once things settled down, the old Franz would return. She protected the image of her husband inside her own mind long after reality had already begun tearing it apart. Then came the small cruelties. He began comparing her to other women. He criticized the way she dressed, saying she looked too plain. He mocked her simple habits, her modest taste, even the way she styled her hair. Once, during dinner, he looked at her and said with a careless shrug, "You really should learn how to keep up. The world moves fast, Margaret. You still look like someone living 10 years in the past." The words pierced her more deeply than she let him see. Still, she only smiled faintly and lowered her gaze. She did not want arguments. She wanted peace, but peace, she would soon learn, could not be built alone. The day her marriage, finally shattered, began like any other morning. The sky was pale and bright, and Margaret had spent the early hours cleaning the apartment, ironing Franz's shirt, and preparing his favorite lunch. He had told her the night before that they would attend a business gathering that afternoon. It would be a casual event, he said, and he wanted her there. That request alone had filled her with a fragile kind of happiness. 4 months, Franz had kept her away from his work life. He no longer introduced her proudly as his wife. He no longer brought her to dinners or celebrations. So when he suddenly asked her to come, she took it as a hopeful sign. Maybe this was a new beginning. She chose a simple but elegant dress and soft cream, one he had once said made her look graceful. She tied her hair neatly, wore light makeup, and stood in front of the mirror trying to ignore the unease in her chest. There was a time when getting ready beside the possibility of seeing Franz smile at her had made her feel like a bride all over again. That afternoon, it only made her nervous. When they arrived at the venue, a stylish rooftop restaurant filled with polished glass, expensive perfume, and the low hum of wealthy conversation, Margaret felt slightly out of place. The women there were glamorous, loud, and effortlessly confident. Their dresses glittered beneath the afternoon sun, and their laughter carried across the room like music. Margareth stood beside Franz quietly, her fingers clasped in front of her, trying to wear dignity like armor. For the first 20 minutes, Franz barely spoke to her. He greeted people, shook hands, laughed too loudly, and moved through the crowd as if Margareth were nothing more than an accessory he had forgotten how to value. She followed at a polite distance, smiling when necessary, though a growing discomfort curled inside her stomach. Then she saw her. A woman in a red fitted dress stood near the bar, one hand resting lightly on a glass of wine. She was beautiful in the polished, dramatic way that demanded attention. Her lipstick was deep, her posture bold, and her smile, when Franz approached her, was far too intimate. Margareth stopped walking. She watched as Franz leaned closer to the woman. She watched the ease between them, the private amusement, the familiarity that did not belong between strangers. The woman touched his arm. Franz did not move away. Something cold slid through Margareth's chest. When Franz finally turned and noticed that Margareth had seen them, he did not look ashamed. He did not look startled. Instead, he smiled with a calmness so cruel that it nearly took her breath away. "Margareth," he said, beckoning her over as if calling a guest to the table. "Come here. There's someone you should meet." Her feet felt heavy, but she walked toward them. The woman's eyes swept over her, lingering just long enough to judge. There was victory in that look, though no word had yet been spoken. "This is Elena," Franz said casually. "She's someone very important to me." The sentence landed like a slap. Margareth forced herself to remain composed. "Important in what way?" Franz let out a short laugh, as if her question amused him. Elena crossed her arms and tilted her head, clearly enjoying the scene already unfolding. "In a way you should have understood a long time ago," Franz replied. "But you never really understood much, did you?" Margareth stared at him, waiting for his face to break, for him to admit this was some twisted joke. It did not happen. The music in the restaurant continued. Conversations carried on around them. Yet for Margareth, everything had narrowed to the man standing before her and the woman beside him. "Franz," she said quietly, "what are you saying?" He exhaled impatiently, then looked at Elena before returning his gaze to Margareth. "I'm saying I'm tired. Tired of pretending. Tired of dragging along a marriage that has been dead for years. Tired of being with someone who has no ambition, no presence, no ability to grow." The blood drained from Margareth's face. She could barely process the words, let alone defend herself against them. "I stood by you," she whispered, "through everything." "Yes," Franz said, his tone hardening, "and maybe that was useful once. But usefulness is not the same as value." The cruelty of it struck so deeply that for a moment she could not breathe. Elena smiled faintly, not even trying to hide her satisfaction. Franz continued, each word more merciless than the last. "Look at you, Margareth. You are weak. You are outdated. You still think being patient and loyal is enough to make someone worth loving. The truth is, you are the kind of woman men outgrow." Margareth felt the humiliation spread through her body like fire beneath her skin. A few nearby guests had begun to notice. Their eyes shifted toward her. Their silence became another form of judgment. She swallowed hard. "If you wanted to leave me," she said, her voice trembling despite her effort to steady it, "you could have said it at home. You did not have to do this." Franz gave a cold, dismissive shrug. "No. You needed to hear it clearly. You needed to understand that I am done being tied to someone who cannot stand beside the life I want now." Elena stepped closer to him then, sliding her arm through his with practiced ease. And that was when the final fracture came. Margareth looked at the two of them standing together openly, shamelessly, while the people around them watched with curiosity disguised as politeness. She realized then that this had been planned. Franz had not invited her there to mend anything. He had brought her there to break her publicly. to make sure the wound would be unforgettable. Tears burned her eyes, but she refused to let them fall in front of them. Her whole body trembled, not with weakness, but with a violent effort of holding herself together. 4 years she had defended Franz to others. 4 years she had silenced her own pain to preserve his dignity. And this was what he gave her in return. Mockery in front of another woman, humiliation in front of strangers, and the destruction of everything she had tried to protect. Margareth lifted her chin, though her heart was crumbling inside her. "Then this is who you truly are," she said. Franz smirked. "No, this is who I've become. You just never kept up." For a second, she said nothing. Then she reached slowly to her ring finger and removed her wedding band. Her hand shook, but her gaze did not leave his face. She placed the ring on a nearby table between them. "I may have been blind," she said softly, "but I was never worthless." Something flickered briefly in Franz's eyes. Annoyance, perhaps, or discomfort, but it disappeared quickly. Margareth turned and walked away before he could answer. She crossed the restaurant floor with as much grace as she could gather, every step an act of survival. She could feel eyes following her. She could feel the pressure building behind her ribs, the ache in her throat, the scream she would not release there. She entered the elevator alone, and the moment the doors closed, the first tear fell. By the time she reached the street, she was no longer holding back. She walked without direction, heels scraping against pavement, tears blurring the city into streaks of light and shadow. She did not know how long she moved like that. Minutes, perhaps, maybe longer. The pain was too large to measure with time. It lived in her chest like something torn open and exposed. When she finally reached a quiet corner near an empty bus stop, she sank onto the bench and pressed her hands over her face. Her marriage was over, not in the quiet, dignified way she had once imagined painful things might end. It had ended with cruelty, betrayal, and deliberate shame. The man she had once called home had made her feel like a burden to be discarded. For the first time in years, Margareth allowed herself to see the truth clearly. Franz had not changed overnight. He had been changing for a long time, and she had loved him so faithfully that she kept forgiving what should never have been forgiven. Night began to settle slowly over the city. The air cooled. Her tears eventually quieted, though the pain remained. Margareth lowered her hands and stared ahead with swollen eyes. In that lonely moment, stripped of illusion, stripped of comfort, stripped even of dignity by the man she had trusted most, something new began to form inside her. It was not hope, not yet. It was something colder, steadier. A refusal. She would grieve. She would bleed in silence if she had to. She would carry the shame and heartbreak of that day for a long time. But she would not let that rooftop become the final definition of her life. Franz had looked at her and seen weakness. One day, she thought, he would learn how wrong he had been. With that silent promise buried deep in her wounded heart, Margareth rose from the bench and stepped into the darkness of her new life alone. The first weeks after the divorce felt less like living and more like surviving. Margareth moved through her days as though the world had been covered in ash. She rented a small apartment on the edge of the city, far from the places she had once visited with Franz, far from the rooftop restaurant where her dignity had been crushed in front of strangers. The rooms were plain, the furniture minimal, and the silence almost unbearable. At night, the emptiness pressed against her chest so heavily that even breathing felt like work. There were mornings when she woke up and forgot, for one fragile second, that she was no longer a wife. Then the truth returned all at once, the humiliation, the betrayal, the cold expression on Franz's face, the sound of his mistress's satisfied silence. On those mornings, Margareth had to sit at the edge of her bed and force herself not to collapse under the weight of memory. But pain, when it could not be escaped, slowly became something else. At first, she cried in private. She cried while washing dishes, while folding her clothes, while standing under the shower with water running down her face. She cried not only for Franz, but for the years she had given him, the dreams she had built around him, and the woman she had been while loving him. She cried for the version of herself who had believed loyalty would be enough to protect her from cruelty. Then one morning, after yet another sleepless night, Margaret looked at her reflection in the mirror and saw something she had not allowed herself to fully confront. She looked small, not physically, but inside. She looked like a woman who had spent too many years shrinking to make someone else feel bigger. She looked like a person who had been trained by love to accept disrespect as sacrifice. And for the first time, she felt anger more clearly than sadness. It was not loud anger. It did not come with screaming or broken glass. It came quietly, like a door closing. That morning, Margaret took a notebook and wrote a single sentence across the first page. I will never be helpless again. She did not know yet what shape her future would take. She only knew that she could not remain the woman Franz had left behind. Margaret had once studied business administration in college, but marriage, household duties, and Franz's unstable years had pushed her own ambitions into the background. She had always been capable, but she had lived as though her intelligence were secondary to her role as a wife. Now, for the first time in years, she returned to the part of herself that had once dreamed beyond domestic walls. She updated her resume, though it pained her to realize how much of her adult life had been invisible labor, supporting Franz, organizing his paperwork, managing finances when he was reckless, helping him draft proposals and presentations that were later praised as his own. The skills were there. She had simply never been credited for them. She began applying for entry-level and administrative positions, not caring that they were far beneath what she privately knew she could do. Pride had no place in survival. She needed a foothold, a first step, a door that would open even slightly. After weeks of rejection and unanswered emails, she was finally offered a junior operations assistant role at a small logistics firm. The salary was modest, the hours were long, the office was crowded, and the work was often thankless. But Margaret accepted immediately. On her first day, no one knew that she had once spent years helping a man build his life while her own faded in the background. No one knew she was carrying the wreckage of public humiliation inside her. To them, she was just a quiet woman in a neat blouse, arriving early, speaking politely, and taking notes with careful attention. That anonymity, painful as it was, also became her freedom. Margaret worked with a focus that startled even her supervisors. She listened more than she spoke. She observed how decisions were made, how departments failed, how leadership either inspired people or exhausted them. She stayed after hours to review reports no one asked her to read. She taught herself software systems she had never used before. At home, she enrolled in online certification programs in management, corporate finance, strategic planning, and organizational leadership. She studied until midnight, often with tired eyes and aching shoulders, but she did not stop. Little by little, the pain that had once felt like an open wound became fuel. Each insult Franz had thrown at her returned now as a challenge. Weak. Then she would work until her discipline proved otherwise. Outdated. Then she would learn faster than people younger and more experienced than her. No value. Then she would become too valuable to ignore. Months passed. Then a year. Margaretha's supervisors began relying on her for more than her assigned tasks. She saw problems before others noticed them. She offered solutions that saved time, reduced waste, and improved coordination across teams. At first, her ideas were repeated by others and accepted without her being fully acknowledged. But unlike before, Margaret no longer stayed silent forever. She learned how to speak with clarity and confidence. She learned how to present her thinking without apology. She learned that intelligence, when paired with composure, could not be dismissed for long. Her first promotion came quietly, Senior Operations Coordinator. Her second came after she led a difficult restructuring project that prevented major losses for the company. By then, something about her presence had changed. She no longer carried herself like a woman asking permission to exist. Her clothes became sharper, though still elegant. Her voice became steadier. Her eyes no longer dropped when someone challenged her. The softness in her remained, but it was no longer the softness of surrender. It was the softness of control. Outside of work, she built herself with equal determination. She read books on leadership, negotiation, and emotional discipline. She learned how to enter a room without shrinking. She joined small professional circles and attended industry seminars, even when it terrified her. At first, she felt exposed in those spaces, surrounded by people who seemed born into confidence. But Margaret soon discovered something important. Many of them were not stronger than her. They had simply never been broken in the same way. By the second year, Margaret was no longer surviving. She was rising. Her reputation began to spread beyond her company. Executives from partner firms noticed her. One mentor in particular, a seasoned corporate leader named Adrian Halim, saw what others had only partially understood. He recognized not only her competence, but her unusual emotional restraint. Margaret had the rare ability to think clearly under pressure without becoming cold. She understood both systems and people. She knew how failure felt from the inside, and because of that, she led with precision instead of vanity. Adrian took an interest in her career, inviting her to strategy meetings and teaching her what real leadership required. Not charm, not noise, not ego. Leadership, he said, was the ability to carry pressure without passing panic to others. Margaret listened carefully. She absorbed everything. When Adrian later moved into an executive chairman role in a larger investment group, he brought her into one of its subsidiaries as director of operations. It was a leap so large that some people whispered she had advanced too quickly. Margaret heard the whispers and ignored them. The people who doubted her had not seen the years behind her composure. They had not seen her studying alone until dawn, working through grief, building a future from humiliation. At the same time, Franz had almost completely erased her from his thinking. In the first months after the divorce, he had expected her to fall apart permanently. He had told himself she would remain what he had accused her of being: weak, dependent, forgettable. He moved on carelessly, enjoying the thrill of a more glamorous life with Elena. He spent recklessly, changed jobs impulsively, and mistook temporary success for permanence. To him, Margaret belonged to the past, a quiet chapter, a discarded life. He never once imagined that while he was wasting what he had, she was building what he could never deserve. By the third year, Margaret's transformation was undeniable. She was no longer the woman who had stood trembling in a rooftop restaurant while strangers watched her humiliation. She had become someone whose entrance altered the atmosphere of a room. Her opinions shaped decisions worth millions. Her discipline made others sharper. Her calm unsettled those who depended on chaos to feel powerful. When the company faced a major crisis involving mismanagement, unstable investor confidence, and declining internal morale, Margaret stepped forward with a recovery plan so clear and effective that it saved the firm from collapse. She reorganized failing divisions, replaced weak executives, restored structure, and rebuilt confidence step by step. The board, initially cautious, soon realized they were watching not just a capable employee but a leader of rare force. In a final meeting that changed everything, the chairman presented his recommendation to appoint a new president-director. There were several older candidates, more politically connected candidates, louder candidates, but when the discussion ended, only one name remained standing with undeniable weight: Margaret. The announcement was made on a rainy afternoon. She sat at the long polished table, listening as the board confirmed the decision. No one in the room saw the woman on a bench 3 years earlier crying beneath a broken sky. No one saw the nights of exhaustion, The loneliness, the old photographs she had finally burned, the trembling hands that had once doubted whether life could begin again. They only saw what she had become. And perhaps that was enough. When the meeting ended, several board members rose to congratulate her. Adrian gave her a quiet nod that carried more pride than any grand speech. Margaret thanked them with steady grace, but inside, something deeper moved through her. Not triumph over Franz. Not yet. Something more private than revenge. Proof. Proof that what had been broken could be rebuilt stronger. Proof that humiliation did not have to become identity. Proof that a woman discarded by one man could still rise high enough to command the respect of many. That evening, Margaret stood alone in her new office for the first time. The room was spacious, lined with glass windows overlooking the city. Rain streaked softly down the skyline, blurring the lights below into gold and silver. On the desk lay a nameplate freshly prepared for her. Margaret Wijaya, President-Director. She looked at it for a long moment. 3 years ago, Franz had said she was the kind of woman men outgrow. Now she stood in silence, elegant in a tailored dark suit, one hand resting lightly against the back of her chair, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. He had been wrong about everything. Margaret no longer needed the world to avenge her pain. She had turned pain itself into discipline, and discipline into power. She had built a life that no longer trembled beneath the judgment of others. She had become a woman whose worth did not need to be argued, because it now spoke in every room she entered. And somewhere beyond the reach of her thoughts, fate was already beginning to turn. Because while Margaret stood at the top of the company she had helped save, Franz was drifting toward the ruins of his own careless choices, unaware that the woman he had once humiliated was no longer beneath him, no longer behind him, and no longer lost. She was waiting at the height he would one day be forced to face. Franz had always mistaken movement for progress. For years, he believed that as long as he looked successful, dressed well, and kept surrounding himself with the right people, his life would continue moving upward. He had once convinced himself that leaving Margaret had been a necessary step toward a more exciting future. Elena had seemed like proof of that future, beautiful, stylish, socially confident, and perfectly suited to the image he wanted the world to admire. With her beside him, he felt validated in ways that fed his ego. He had traded loyalty for glamour and called it growth. But glamour, Franz would eventually learn, could not carry the weight of a collapsing life. At first, the cracks appeared in places he thought he could manage. One failed investment, one delayed payment, one business contact who stopped returning his calls. Then another. Franz had never been particularly disciplined with money, but during the years when his career seemed to rise easily, he had hidden that flaw behind confidence. He spent like a man who believed tomorrow would always refill what today had emptied. Expensive dinners, impulsive purchases, luxury weekends, polished appearances. He maintained them all as if image itself could protect him from consequence. It could not. The company he had joined after leaving Margaret initially welcomed him for his charm and apparent connections. Franz knew how to speak in meetings with just enough confidence to impress people who were too distracted to notice the emptiness behind his words. But charm was a poor substitute for substance. As the business environment grew more competitive, the expectations around him tightened. Results mattered, strategy mattered, discipline mattered, and Franz, who had long depended on appearance and persuasion, began to fail where real pressure demanded real competence. Reports were mishandled. Opportunities slipped away because of careless follow-up. Internal trust weakened. A project he had insisted would succeed ended in embarrassing losses. The executives who had once smiled at him began speaking more cautiously. He noticed the change but responded the way insecure men often did, with blame. He blamed his team, the market, the company culture, and the economy. He blamed everyone except himself. At home, things were no better. Elena, who who had once laughed at his jokes and admired his expensive taste, had no patience for a man whose shine was fading. Their relationship, once built on thrill and vanity, began to rot under the weight of reality. She no longer looked at him with admiration. She looked at him with calculation. Franz noticed how often she checked her phone when he spoke, how easily irritation flashed across her face when he mentioned money, how quickly she dismissed his frustration when his work problems worsened. One evening, after an argument over unpaid bills and a canceled vacation she had been expecting him to fund, Elena stood in the middle of their apartment with her arms crossed and her voice cold. "You're not the man I thought you were," she said. The sentence hit him harder than he wanted to admit, not because it was profound, but because it echoed something ugly and familiar. Once long ago, he had used that tone on Mara Gareth, the tone of someone reducing another person to disappointment. Franz tried to recover his pride. "Things are temporary," he said sharply. "You act like one bad period means everything is over." Elena let out a dry laugh. "Temporary? Franz, you've been saying that for almost a year. Every month, it's another excuse, another promise, another story about how you'll fix everything." His jaw tightened. "So what? You're giving up now?" "No," she replied, grabbing her handbag from the table. "I'm leaving now." She walked out that same night. Franz stood alone in the expensive apartment he could no longer comfortably afford, staring at the door she had closed behind her. It was strange, he thought, how quickly a person could become a stranger once they no longer benefited from staying. For the first time in a long while, the silence around him did not feel like peace. It felt like exposure. In the months that followed, his situation deteriorated further. The company terminated his position after a formal review exposed repeated failures, weak leadership, and poor financial judgment on a project he had overseen. He left the office not with outrage, but with a hollow numbness that made everything around him feel distant. He had spent years presenting himself as a man destined for more, and now he was carrying a box of office belongings to his car like someone whose entire performance had finally been seen through. At first, he believed another opportunity would come quickly. He adjusted his resume, polished his old confidence, and began applying. But the job market was less forgiving than his ego had expected. His experience looked stronger on paper than in reality. Interviews did not lead anywhere. Calls went unanswered. Rejections arrived in emails, written with polite indifference. Savings shrank. Rent became heavier. Debts he had ignored began to circle back toward him. Desperation changed the way he saw the world. Suddenly, the cafes where he used to meet clients felt too expensive. The tailored suits in his closet looked less like proof of status and more like relics from a life slipping away. Even his face began to change. The easy arrogance that once sat so naturally in his expression was replaced by fatigue, irritation, and the restless anxiety of a man whose self-image was collapsing faster than his circumstances. One rainy afternoon, while scrolling through job listings in a nearly empty coffee shop, Franz found a vacancy at a highly respected corporate group, Wijaya Strategic Holdings. The opening was for a mid-level managerial role in operations development, a position slightly below what he once would have considered acceptable, but still respectable enough to restore some dignity. The company was known for its structure, discipline, and steady growth. Its new leadership, according to recent industry coverage, had transformed it into one of the most admired firms in the sector. Franz stared at the listing longer than necessary. He had heard of the company before, of course. Everyone in certain business circles had. But he had never paid much attention to its internal leadership. The president-director's name had been mentioned in articles he skimmed and ignored. Corporate success stories bored him when they were about people he did not know, or thought he did not know. He submitted his application with more care than usual. He rewrote his cover letter, sharpened his resume, and leaned heavily on what remained of his professional polish. A week later, he received an invitation for an interview and assessment session at the company headquarters. For the first time in months, he felt a flicker of confidence return. "This is it," he muttered to himself that morning while adjusting his tie in front of the bathroom mirror. A restart. He chose one of his best suits, though it no longer fit as sharply as it once had. He trimmed his beard carefully, styled his hair, and rehearsed answers in the car on the way there. By the time he arrived, the old performance had already begun to settle back over him like a familiar mask. The headquarters tower rose above the city in clean lines of steel and glass, modern and imposing without the need for flashy excess. The lobby alone was enough to remind Franz how far his own life had slipped. Everything inside reflected control, quiet efficiency, tasteful luxury, staff who moved with purpose, and the kind of atmosphere that made mediocrity feel visible. As he approached the reception desk, he straightened his shoulders. The receptionist greeted him politely and asked for his name. "Franz Adrian," he said, offering a practiced smile. She typed something into her system, then nodded. "Please wait a moment, Mr. Adrian. Someone from HR will assist you shortly." He sat in the waiting area, crossing one leg over the other, trying to project calm. Around him, professionals moved through the lobby with badges clipped neatly to tailor jackets. He studied the place carefully, already imagining what it would feel like to belong there again. He could rebuild here, he thought. Regain position. Regain respect. A young HR officer soon arrived and guided him through the initial interview process. Franz performed well enough. He knew how to speak about growth, adaptability, and resilience. He polished his failures into learning experiences. He described his past positions with selective confidence and softened the details that might reveal more than he wanted. The interview panel remained professional, though not particularly warm. Their questions were precise. Their faces gave little away. Still, Franz left the room believing he had done reasonably well. Then, as he was preparing to leave, the HR officer returned. "Mr. Adrian," she said, "the president-director would like to see you before you go." Franz blinked. "The president-director?" "Yes." His first reaction was surprise, quickly followed by a swell of ego he had not felt in months. Perhaps, he thought, someone at the top had seen potential in him. Perhaps his background had carried more weight than he realized. Maybe this company moved fast when it found talent. He smiled. "Of course." As he followed the officer toward the executive floor, his confidence grew. He adjusted his cuffs, lifted his chin slightly, and began imagining how this private meeting might change everything. Maybe the president-director had recognized something exceptional in him. Maybe he would be offered a better role than the one he applied for. The idea restored an old, dangerous pride inside him. They stepped into a private elevator. The ride upward was silent. When the doors opened, Franz entered a floor unlike the rest of the building, quieter, more refined, marked by the restrained elegance of real power. The carpeting softened each step. The lighting was warm without being inviting. The receptionist on that floor rose respectfully as they passed. The HR officer stopped outside a large office with frosted glass panels and dark wood framing. "Please wait here," she said. "Her assistant will bring you in." Her. Franz barely registered the word. A few moments later, a woman in a navy suit approached. Her posture was flawless, her expression calm. "Mr. Adrian," she said, "please come in. The president-director is expecting you." Franz nodded and stepped through the open door. The office was spacious, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city skyline. Rain drifted lightly across the glass outside. The furniture was modern, elegant, expensive without being excessive. On one side stood a shelf lined with awards, financial reports, and international business journals. On the desk sat a nameplate turned slightly away from him. Behind the desk, the large leather chair faced the windows. The person seated there had their back to him. Franz took a few steps forward, waiting. He felt a strange tension he could not immediately explain. Perhaps it was simply the pressure of standing before someone powerful. Perhaps it was the silence in the room, too controlled to be comfortable. Then the assistant spoke softly. "Ma'am, Mr. Adrian is here." A pause, and then the chair turned. It happened slowly, without drama, without the slightest need for theatrical effect. The woman seated behind the desk wore a sharply tailored dark suit. Her hair was styled with effortless elegance. Her posture was composed, her gaze steady, her expression unreadable. Franz felt the air leave his lungs. For one impossible second, his mind refused to understand what his eyes were seeing. Margareth, not the Margareth he had last seen walking away from him in humiliation with tears burning in her eyes. Not the quiet wife in a simple dress whom he had dismissed as weak and outdated. This woman was something else entirely. Refined, powerful, untouchable. She did not merely sit in the office. She belonged to it in a way that made everything around her seem arranged by her will. Franz stared at her as if the ground beneath him had suddenly disappeared. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. Margareth looked at him calmly, almost thoughtfully, as though studying a figure from a distant and irrelevant past. There was no visible anger in her face, no trembling, no brokenness. That, more than anything, shook him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Adrian," she said. Her voice was smooth, controlled, and devastatingly familiar. Franz swallowed hard. "Margareth!" A faint pause followed, and then she corrected him with cool precision. "President-Director Margareth Wijaya," she said. "While you are in this office, I suggest you address me properly." The humiliation struck him at once, sharp, total, and inescapable. His ex-wife, the woman he had mocked, the woman he had discarded, now sat before him as the most powerful person in the building he had entered hoping would save him. And in that terrible, breathless moment, Franz understood that fate had not brought him there by accident. It had brought him there to make him look directly at everything he had once refused to see. For a moment, the room felt impossibly quiet. Franz stood frozen a few steps away from the desk, his mind struggling to process the reality in front of him. The woman he had once dismissed as weak now sat behind a desk that commanded the entire floor. The city skyline stretched behind her like a symbol of authority, and every detail in the room, every polished surface, every carefully arranged document, seemed to reflect her control over the world he had just entered. Margareth watched him calmly. There was no visible anger in her expression. No bitterness twisted her voice. Instead, she looked at him with the composed detachment of someone evaluating a minor business matter. "Please sit," she said. Her tone was polite, but it carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Franz hesitated for half a second before lowering himself into the chair across from her desk. His movements felt strangely heavy, as though his body were suddenly aware of the humiliating imbalance between them. 3 years ago, he had stood tall while she trembled. Now he could barely hold her gaze. Margareth opened a slim folder resting on the desk in front of her. Inside were the documents HR had collected about Franz's application. She scanned them briefly, her eyes moving with practiced efficiency. "You applied for the Operations Development Manager position," she said. Franz cleared his throat. "Yes." She nodded slightly. "You previously worked at 2 companies within the logistics and supply chain sector," she continued. "Your last position ended unexpectedly." The word was chosen carefully, and Franz felt its weight. He forced himself to speak with confidence. "There were internal disagreements about strategy. I believed a different direction would have produced better results." Margareth looked up from the file. The faintest hint of something unreadable crossed her eyes. "Interesting," she said calmly, "because according to the financial reports attached here, the project you supervised produced significant losses." Franz felt heat creep up his neck. "Well," he said stiffly, "those outcomes involved multiple departments. It wasn't solely my responsibility." Margareth closed the folder gently. Her fingers rested on top of it for a moment before she leaned back slightly in her chair. Franz waited. He expected anger, perhaps cold revenge, perhaps immediate dismissal from the building. Instead, Margareth spoke with the quiet precision of someone discussing routine business. "You must have been surprised to see me here," she said. Franz exhaled slowly. "I didn't know you were leading this company. That much is obvious." The simplicity of her answer struck him harder than an insult would have. For a few seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Franz forced himself to meet her eyes. "Look," he said carefully, "I know our past was complicated, but I came here because I need a professional opportunity. Whatever happened between us doesn't have to affect that." Margaretha's expression remained calm. "Professional opportunity," she repeated softly. "Yes. You believe that is what this is about." Franz shifted slightly in his chair. "I'm qualified for the position," he said, "and I'm willing to prove it." Margareth studied him for a moment, her gaze steady and thoughtful. There was no emotional turbulence in her face, only the controlled stillness of someone who had long ago finished grieving. "Franz," she said quietly. It was the first time she had spoken his name without a title. The sound of it unsettled him. "You once told me something," she continued. "Do you remember?" He frowned slightly. "You said I was weak, that I had no value, that I was the kind of woman men outgrow." Franz felt a sharp tension run through his chest. "That was a long time ago," he muttered. "Yes," Margareth replied. "It was." Her tone held no accusation, which somehow made it worse. "But you are correct about one thing," she continued. "Our past does not need to affect this situation." Franz blinked. "You mean?" Margareth folded her hands lightly on the desk. "I mean this is a company," she said. "And in a company, decisions are based on what is useful." For the first time since entering the office, a flicker of hope stirred in Franz's chest. "Exactly," he said quickly. "That's all I'm asking for. A chance to contribute." Margareth nodded once. "I agree." Franz leaned forward slightly, relief beginning to loosen the tightness in his shoulders. "So you're saying—" "I am saying," Margareth interrupted gently, "that I will give you a position in this company." For a moment, Franz could hardly believe what he was hearing. A rush of gratitude and renewed pride filled him. "Thank you," he said quickly. "You won't regret this." Margaretha's expression did not change. "I doubt that." Franz blinked again. "Starting tomorrow," she continued calmly, "you will report to the Facilities Management Department." He frowned slightly. "Facilities Management?" "Yes. The department responsible for building maintenance." Something in his stomach tightened. "I don't understand," he said slowly. Margaretha's voice remained perfectly composed. "You applied for a managerial role. Unfortunately, based on your record and the results of your previous projects, I cannot justify placing you in a position of strategic responsibility." Franz felt his jaw tighten. "So you're rejecting me?" "No," Margareth replied. "I told you I would give you a position." She slid a small document across the desk toward him. "This is your employment contract." Franz looked down at the paper. His eyes moved across the first few lines. Then they stopped. The words felt unreal. "Cleaning Service Staff, Corporate Facilities Division." His head snapped up. "You can't be serious." Margaretha's gaze remained steady. "I am completely serious." Franz felt anger surge through him. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "I'm not applying to clean floors." "No," Margareth agreed calmly. "You applied for something you are not qualified to handle." Her words landed like a hammer. "You're doing this to humiliate me," Franz said bitterly. Margareth tilted her head slightly. "Humiliation." She repeated the word as if considering it. "I'm offering you employment, a salary, stability. That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" she asked quietly. Franz struggled to answer, because somewhere deep inside, he already knew. The point was pride, and his pride was collapsing under the reality in front of him. Margaret leaned forward slightly. 3 years ago, she said softly, you believed my value was limited to standing quietly behind you. Her voice remained calm, but the meaning beneath it was unmistakable. Today, I am offering you a chance to stand somewhere in the same building as me. Franz clenched his fists. You expect me to accept this? No, Margaret replied. I expect you to make your own decision. She gestured lightly toward the document. You can refuse and walk out that door. No one will stop you. Her eyes held us steadily. Or you can accept the position. Franz stared at her, breathing unevenly. Outside the window behind her, rain continued sliding down the glass. In that moment, the distance between who he had once believed himself to be and who he had become felt unbearable. 3 years ago, he had humiliated her publicly. Now he was sitting across from her desk, being offered a job cleaning the floors beneath her authority. And the cruelest part was this. She was not shouting. She was not mocking him. She was simply giving him the same quiet indifference he had once given her. Franz looked down again at the contract. His bank account was nearly empty. His debts were growing, and the job market had already shown him how little his old confidence was worth. The silence stretched. Finally, Margaret spoke again. If you accept, she said calmly, your supervisor will explain your responsibilities tomorrow morning. Franz's throat tightened. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, slowly, he picked up the pen. His hand trembled slightly as he signed his name. When he finished, he pushed the paper back toward her without looking up. Margaret took the document and closed the folder. Welcome to Ajaya Strategic Holdings, she said. Franz stood. He felt smaller than he had ever felt in his life. As he turned toward the door, Margaret spoke once more. Franz. He stopped, but he did not turn around. In this building, she said quietly, everyone contributes to its success, even those who clean it. Her voice carried neither cruelty nor kindness, only truth. Franz opened the door and walked out without answering. The hallway outside felt colder than before. Behind him, inside the office, Margaret returned to her work as if nothing unusual had happened. And in that silent continuation of her day lay the final proof of something Franz had once been too arrogant to understand. True revenge did not require anger. Sometimes, it only required success. The first morning Franz arrived at the building as an employee again felt different from every other time he had walked through its doors. Before, he had entered with the careful posture of a job applicant, someone hoping to impress the people around him. Now he walked through the same glass doors, wearing a simple gray uniform with the company's maintenance emblem stitched on the chest. The badge clipped to his pocket did not display a title, a department, or any sign of authority. It only showed his name, Franz Adrian, facility staff. The lobby that had once looked impressive now felt intimidating in a different way. Employees in suits moved quickly through the hall with tablets and documents in their hands. Some were discussing quarterly targets. Others spoke about meetings with investors and regional partners. The atmosphere carried the quiet energy of a company that knew exactly where it was going. Franz lowered his gaze slightly as he walked toward the maintenance office at the back of the building. He told himself it was only temporary. Just a job. Just a step to survive until something better appeared. But deep inside, he knew something else was happening. Every step through that building forced him to confront the reality of the life he had once thrown away. His supervisor was a middle-aged man named Pak Rudy, a calm but disciplined facilities manager who had worked in the building long before Margaret became president-director. "You're the new one?" Pak Rudy asked when Franz entered the maintenance office. "Yes." Pak Rudy handed him a cleaning cart and a checklist. "Start with the executive floor restrooms and hallway maintenance," he said. "Then move to the conference wing." Franz hesitated for half a second. "The executive floor?" "Yes," Pak Rudy replied, already turning to another task. That's where we start every morning. Franz swallowed quietly. The executive floor, Margaretha's floor. A strange heaviness settled in his chest, but he said nothing. He pushed the cleaning cart toward the elevator and rode it up alone. When the doors opened, the quiet elegance of the executive floor greeted him again. The thick carpet muffled the sound of his steps. Sunlight poured through the tall windows, reflecting off polished surfaces that had been designed to communicate success without arrogance. Franz began his work silently. He wiped the glass panels along the hallway. He polished the marble counters near the reception area. He emptied waste bins outside meeting rooms where executives discussed projects worth millions. And all the while, he felt the weight of something invisible pressing down on him. Every person who walked past him wore the kind of professional confidence he once believed belonged to him. Some nodded politely in passing. Others barely noticed him. To them, he was simply part of the background now. The man pushing a cleaning cart, the man wiping surfaces, the man ensuring their workspace remained spotless. Franz kept his head down and continued working. But fate, it seemed, was not finished teaching him. Around mid-morning, the receptionist on that floor stood quickly from her desk. "Good morning, ma'am," she said respectfully. Franz's hands froze on the cloth he was holding. He knew that voice. The soft sound of footsteps followed. Calm, measured. Franz slowly turned his head. Margaret walked through the hallway with quiet confidence, accompanied by two senior executives discussing a financial presentation. She wore a tailored navy suit, her posture elegant and steady. Her presence carried authority without needing to demand attention. Yet attention followed her naturally. Employees greeted her with respect. Conversations paused when she passed. Even the atmosphere seemed to sharpen slightly around her. She looked nothing like the woman he had once humiliated. Not fragile, not small, not dependent. She looked like someone who had earned every inch of the ground she stood on. Franz quickly looked down again and continued wiping the glass. His heart beat faster, though he did not know why. Margaret walked past him without stopping. For a moment, he wondered if she had even noticed him. Then, just as she reached the end of the hallway, she paused. Franz felt the movement behind him. He straightened slightly, unsure whether to look up. Margaret turned calmly toward the receptionist. "Please make sure the meeting room is ready for the board discussion in 30 minutes, she said. "Yes, ma'am." Her voice remained composed, professional, focused. Then she continued walking. She did not look at Franz. She did not acknowledge his presence. She simply moved forward with her day. And somehow, that hurt more than anger ever could. Franz finished the hallway cleaning slowly. Inside his chest, something unfamiliar was beginning to take shape. Regret. Not the shallow regret he had occasionally felt when things first started falling apart in his life. This was deeper, heavier, because now he saw what Margaret had become. He saw the respect people gave her. He saw the confidence in the way she spoke. He saw the life she had built without him. And for the first time, he truly understood what he had lost. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. Franz continued working quietly in the building. Every morning, he cleaned the floors beneath the offices where executives planned expansions and partnerships. Every afternoon, he emptied trash bins filled with documents from decisions that shaped entire markets. And almost every day, he saw Margaret, sometimes in meetings, sometimes walking through the hallway, sometimes standing near the window of her office while speaking on the phone about investments and strategies. She never treated him cruelly. She never mocked him, but she never treated him like someone important either. He was simply part of the building now, part of its structure, part of its quiet maintenance. And that quiet distance slowly forced Franz to confront the truth he had spent years avoiding. Margaret had not needed revenge. Her success had already answered everything. One evening, long after most employees had left, Franz was cleaning the hallway outside her office when the door opened behind him. He turned. Margareth stepped out with a folder in her hand. For the first time since the day of his hiring, they stood alone. Franz felt the old tension return instantly. He lowered his gaze. "Good evening, President-Director," he said quietly. Margareth studied him for a moment. He looked thinner now. The confidence that once filled his posture had faded. The arrogance in his voice was gone. In its place was something quieter, something more honest. "You've been working here for several months," she said. "Yes. Have you adjusted?" Franz hesitated. "I'm managing." Margareth nodded slightly. Silence settled between them. Finally, Franz spoke again. "I was wrong," he said. The words came out slowly. "I thought success was something easy, something I deserved automatically. I thought people were replaceable." He swallowed. "And I thought you would always be beneath me." Margareth listened without interruption. Franz exhaled softly. "I see now how wrong I was." Margareth looked at him for a long moment. Then she spoke calmly. "I already know that." Franz blinked slightly. "You don't need to say anything else," she continued. "Apologies are not necessary." Her tone was not cruel. It was simply final. "Your life is your responsibility now," she said. "And mine is mine." She stepped past him toward the elevator. Franz watched her go. As the elevator doors closed behind her, he stood alone in the hallway, holding the cleaning cloth in his hand. For the first time, he understood something clearly. Margareth had already moved beyond the past. The humiliation he had once inflicted no longer controlled her life, but it would remain part of his forever. He returned to his cleaning cart and continued working quietly. And far above the city skyline, inside an office filled with light and ambition, Margareth looked out over the horizon with calm determination. Her life no longer belonged to pain. It belonged to everything she had built after it. The woman who had once been publicly humiliated had become something far stronger than revenge. She had become proof that a broken heart could rebuild itself into greatness. And that was a victory no one could ever take from her.